Good evening. Today is March 28, 2022, and it's the 91st episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My guest today is a dear friend of mine, Michel Wyss. Michael is coming to us live from Switzerland. Mike is a scientific assistant at the Military Academy, or MILAC, as we call it, at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH, Zurich, and is a lecturer in the Strategic Studies in the BA and the Public Policy Studies program. He received his Master's of Arts in from the government, from Lauderdale School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel, where we met for the first time. He also, at the same time, was a recipient of the Reganos Scholarship and a visiting researcher affiliated with the Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ, School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. Prior to MILAC, he worked for the International Institute for Counterterrorism, or ICT, and the Corporate Security Unit of the German Development Corporation and the Federal Office of Defense Procurement specifically. His research has been interests in political science, multi-strategy, and irregular warfare. And his work has been published in Democracy and Security and Lawfare, among other major publications. Mike, it's good to have you here, buddy. I know it's been a long time since we spoke, but I know last time you were here, you specifically talked about what is the proxy war evolution looking like, and you were right on spot on almost a year plus ago. So it's good to have you here again with us.
Hey, Sargis, thanks for having me. And yeah, indeed, good to be back. Yeah, so exactly what we're talking about. There are a lot of new proxy wars going on. I mean, specifically, there's one very big proxy war going on right now in the middle of Europe, almost, or not in the middle, in the east. And I think this is on the one hand, what we're seeing is still kind of this evolution of proxy warfare is also affecting, obviously, this conflict. Of course, I'm talking about the war of Russia and Ukraine right now. And at the same time, you could almost argue that we have some kind of blast from the past. I mean, we're really back into this proxy configuration that we also saw during the Cold War between the West on the one side and obviously the Russia on the other side.
You know, one thing I know that, when we talked about proxy wars last time, and we're looking at it as taking place currently, in the past, we had looked at non-state actors as being actors that really, at the end of the day, really supported the state apparatus. In this case, you had a conventional force structures like, in this case, the Ukrainians have and the Russians still battling each other. But I don't know if it was seen by anybody, maybe some of the individuals out there that I may not be aware of who had done the studies. Was it ever seen the ability of what non-state actors can do right now? As an example, Elon Musk using his company's capability to really provide satellite capabilities or internet access for the Ukrainians in this fight. Did you ever see anything like this, or did any of the military academies you think had kind of glimpse to the possibility of how these non-state actors could actually be involved in these proxy wars and support the conventional forces on the ground at the level they're doing today?
No, I don't think so. At least I wouldn't be aware of any specific literature or even discussions on this kind of topic. But I absolutely agree with you. I mean, this is another evolution, and you have obviously you have these companies bringing in their technology, helping one of the conflict parties in ways that I guess we haven't seen before. I mean, on the other hand, it's not a complete new. I don't know. It's not a revolution. Perhaps more of some kind of evolution. I mean, if you remember 10 years ago during the Arab uprisings, that this is also the first time when already social media was used in specific ways, or even during the protests in Iran in 2009. That a lot of protesters used social media to get videos out, to get the attention of the global community for their plight, for whatever they were fighting for. And I think this is in this case, bringing in Starlink, using these capabilities from the civilian market. I think this is it's definitely not revolutionary, but it's evolutionary. And I mean, also if you think about it, the way we're seeing mini drones used nowadays, you could also argue, of course, I mean, this is not done specifically for one side. I mean, these DJI drones from China, for example, they're really being used by both sides, by both the Russians and the Ukrainians. What's also interesting in this regard is that basically both the Ukrainians and probably also the Russians, I think they have done less so publicly. I mean, both of them basically asked DJI to, hey, please block access from the other side, make sure that the other side cannot fly these drones over the combat zone. And they were very, they were really trying to keep a neutral stance and basically telling both sides, look, we won't do anything as long as they're not some specific request. We're we're just gonna roll with it. We're gonna let these drones fly.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that this whole battlefield is evolving is what the realignments are. As an example, Anonymous, that was initially really targeting NATO before the war, turned around its gaze and started attacking Russia. Now, both sides are able to benefit from it. Initially, it was an enemy of NATO. Now it's an enemy of Russia on the side of NATO. How do you see these type of organizational structures, these non-state actors evolving as this battle continues between the Ukraine and Russia? Because at the end of the day, the two states have to come to an agreement because international policy is state to state where laws are made. You mentioned Syria. I know that ISIS tried their best to initially set up a state in order to be able to have be able to be relevant on the world stage. Of course, they weren't able to do that. We were able to destroy the state that they were trying to establish. But how do you see this evolvement of these non-state actors? What are the pluses and minuses that you see that has to be looked at by our military professionals as they're going to the military academies to learn about how to maybe handle these type of future wars?
Yeah, it's a very fascinating question, right? I mean, first, I will make the point that, okay, Anonymous, they came out of that. Yes, they are attacking Russia now. I mean, we don't know exactly to what extent they're actually being successful. I would also actually even make the point and say, like sometimes, okay, it appears now that Anonymous is doing these attacks. But for example, we don't know who else is also doing these attacks, right? We don't know whether perhaps we're not going to name any states, but whether someone else's cyber command, for example, is also trying to pretend to be anonymous and also interferes, for example, with Russian cyber capabilities or attacking Russian websites. I think this is one of the very fascinating aspects that it is incredibly difficult to make attribution when it comes to these kind of cyber attacks. I mean, you might also remember this is an older story, but you remember this attack against actually U.S. government. Exactly, against the U.S. government. What was it? The Office of Personal something. I forgot the correct name, but they were always saying that it was the Islamic State doing this cyber attack and, stealing a lot of personal data from U.S. government employees. And I was always kind of weirded out by this story. And I was always thinking, well, who tells us that this isn't the Chinese or the North Koreans or whoever who actually pretend to be the Islamic State, attack this this website or whatever, this server and take the data from there. I think that so this makes it incredibly difficult, to actually attribute these attacks to actually really figure out who's doing these attacks. But to get back to the question with the pros and cons, I mean, of course, an organization like Anonymous, they seem to have certain capabilities, so they can be quite useful. When they're being used against Russia, but they will be much less useful, or they're going to be problematic if they turn against you. And I mean, how to control that, we don't know. I would, you go ahead. Buddy. Okay.
No, I mean, look, I think we were talking about the realignment, especially because you have right now even in the current fight you have, as the discussions are taking place, the diplomats for Ukraine, every time they meet with a European power or anybody out there to want to get support, they constantly say, we're going to remember whether or not you guys helped us or not in this fight, knowing that there's going to be a future settlement. That's where the worry becomes. States in the past used to maybe call you on the floor mat, as we would say in the U.S., or call you out, and you would figure that, well, if there's ever a future war, it's going to be state to state. But now it's possible that states can use any of those non-state actors who have the power and the ability to be able to counter somebody. I had a guest last week that we were talking to, and he said, what would happen if the Elon Musk satellites one day are turned against the United States? And it's because it's been proven that it can work in Ukraine. How would you counter something like that? So I'm not sure how far out the traditional military guys look at what happens with the evolution on the battlefield as what happens with this evolution across the board when it comes to how the non-state actors are being used.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think I would also, go a step back and talk about, really some other forms of realignment that we're seeing in Europe right now. I mean, I got to be honest with you. When I first heard the reactions by the European states right after the invasion, like next couple of, it really took like 1 or 2 days, and a lot of paradigms that we thought were really sacrosanct, basically, that were really thrown out of the window. Like, for example, you had Germany who came in and said, okay, now actually we're going to make an exception to our long-standing policy of not delivering lethal aid into a war zone. They did exactly that. And you had neutral states like Sweden or Finland, who are neither were also not part of NATO, who are in the European Union, but also they basically decided they're also going to send weapons, including anti-tank weapons, including air defense weapons, manpads, basically. And I found this very interesting. This was a very quick development. Basically went, from almost from one day to the next. It was extremely fascinating to see compared to, what happened before the actual Russian Revolution, right? I mean, we also got to remember that the weeks before, we already were having these discussions, and basically Germany said, no, absolutely not. We're not going to send lethal aid. Basically, the Europeans, they couldn't even find a common line talking about sanctions, how whether or not the Russians should be sanctioned, whether or not, Nord Stream 2, this big project, should be further pursued or not. And then really, like, it took 1 or 2 days, and all these previous paradigms, they flew out of the window. And to me, this was really fascinating to see. Was also a little bit concerning to see, because I'm really curious, how much thought actually went into all of this, and how much of it was actually, domino effect, basically, because obviously the US started with a lot of military aid. They already did that before. And then 1 or 2, or maybe a couple of more European countries did the same thing. And then basically it seemed a bit like the others started to fall in line. I thought this was very interesting. And maybe if I can just make another point in this regard, what I also found extremely interesting is what happened to the whole, the whole topic of foreign fighters or war volunteers, legionnaires, whatever you want to call it, right? I mean, so for 10 years in Europe, we faced a big challenge. Not only Europe, obviously, it was also North Africa, it was also the Americas to some degree. With people going to the war zone, going to Syria, going to Iraq, fighting, a lot of them obviously fighting for Al-Qaeda, fighting for Islamic State, but also others, fighting for the Kurdish fighters in northern Syria, for Kurdish in Iraq, etc. And we always said, basically all the European countries said that this is a big problem, this is a huge challenge. We're getting people going to these countries. In some instances, coming back, being battle hardened, being trained, and they might pose a threat to public security. And now, what happened with Ukraine is that not only did you have a lot of countries basically saying, okay, we're going to tolerate our citizens, going to Ukraine, joining the war. Not only that, but I mean, you had a bunch of European countries basically encouraging it. I mean, you had the in United Kingdom, you have Liz Truss, basically the Secretary of State, I guess you would say, in the United States. Well, so she basically said, yes, I absolutely, encourage everyone going. I absolutely support that. You had the same thing happening with the Prime Minister in Denmark. And also, again, this I found very fascinating and a little bit concerning to see, because I think there's a lot of potential issues also with people going there. Of course, we also need to acknowledge that it's not exactly the same thing. We still have a working government in the Ukraine. These people that joining the Ukrainian armed forces now, they're being regulated to some degrees. They're being part of effective units. But we also have to be honest about it that maybe the whole vetting process. I don't know how good this really is. There were a bunch of stories coming out in recent days. Right. And, there were some horror stories, like guys being on drugs, not listening to their Ukrainian officers who would be in charge, basically doing whatever they wanted. And I think also that, they haven't proven that combat effective yet. So I'm also kind of wondering whether this is really an advantage for the Ukrainians, whether this is actually really going to help them or not.
No, I don't know if it's going to be an advantage. I mean, when I was advisory for the Assyrian military or Assyrian army, where we fought against ISIS in Syria and Iraq from 2014 to 2017, actually the first American volunteer that showed up to volunteer to fight with the forces was on Christmas Eve. And I tried my best to get him to get back home, because I said, look, this is going to affect your, standing, your future when it comes with the U.S. government, to include the fact that you're a veteran. And I couldn't get the embassy to take, to convince him to go back, because the embassy said he's a U.S. citizen, he can do whatever he wants, and we can't put those limitations on him. And I come to find out after that incident that we even have Americans who are out there literally, running arms, doing whatever they want, and the governments really don't go after them, which was mind blowing for me. But we had Japanese, we had Korean, we had everybody else come. I tried to keep it more at the defensive level, although it showed that, everybody was standing with our Assyrian army, the Christian army that was fighting in Iraq and Syria. I didn't want to see any of them become casualties on the battlefield, because just getting him back, processing him, make sure that everything was done correctly. So the offensive capabilities we had, what we ran offensively, was really with the local folks that were not foreign fighters. But with that said, I will tell you that in 2015, when the Khabur River Valley in northern Syria was being cleansed out, had one of our commanders assassinated by the YPG Kurds at the time, because the Kurds were infighting, trying to take over some of those territories that the Syrian Christians were in. And Antifa US was actually flying their flag with that unit at that time. Fast forward to a couple of years later, Antifa was all over inside of the United States, causing issues, attacking federal courts, facilities in the states, and became really something that really ground into American psyche here as to how he destabilized the United States internally, at least under the previous POTUS it was. Now they've kind of quieted it down. But the reality was that you had a unit, you had people who actually even, Rolling Stone magazine covered as being this sexy unit participating with an organization, that was designated as a terror organization, that killed one of my commanders on the ground. At the same time that we had him designated as a terror unit, U.S. was giving funding to Iraqi government that was giving money to the Kurds in northern Iraq that was funneling the money to the YPG anyway. So it's this so-called war of proxies and hybrid. There's so many links to it that even the people who are think that they can manage it have lost control of it. I mean, there's 70 Japanese that are in Ukraine right now. That's count fighting there. Why are the Japanese fighting in Ukraine? Who knows? Know, and who knows what intelligence and information is being gathered for military purposes for those nations.
Right, exactly. And I mean, this is really where you see a lot of parallels, right? You also obviously you have the stories coming out. I mean, we also have to say that the Ukrainians right now, they're doing a fantastic job when it comes to to information operations. Like you really have a lot of really good content that you find online that is being distributed across a lot of channels. And I mean, of course, it's also, it's as you said before, it's a sexy topic. These foreign fighters, joining another country's army, to fight a good fight. And of course, we're seeing all of that. And I mean, I want to say, of course, I mean, I also respect that to a degree that that you're going there, you want to help Ukrainians. I have a lot of respect for all of that. To me, the point is, again, what I don't understand is that we had this huge discussion going on for 10 years where basically we're saying, look, foreign fighters, they're bad news. They're going to cause a lot of trouble, going forward. Now, all of a sudden, we're reversing all these policies. And I mean, there's a bunch of things. I think if we want to, dig into that a little bit, that where I see huge challenges. First of all, I mean, if there are war crimes being committed by guys like that, so who's responsible in the end? I mean, again, yeah, of course, theoretically, they're regulated. They're part of the reserves. Actually, I think that most international legionnaires, they basically are part of the territorial defense forces of the Ukraine, which is reserves basically. So you could argue that it's going to be their responsibility, but whether this is going to work out, I mean, again, this is precisely also what we saw, especially in Europe. I remember this very well. We had a lot of guys, going to Syria, fighting for Islamic State, fighting for Al Qaeda or whatever. And to actually convict them very often, like it was impossible, to get evidence on the ground. So basically what we had to do is basically just convict them for the fact, that they were traveling there, that they basically were joining a terrorist organization. And now if you're basically saying, well, you guys, you can do that, you can go to Ukraine, I can tell that if there are going to be war crimes, and I'm sure they're already being committed right now on both sides. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It is a war after all. Ugly things happen in war, so it's going to be really, really hard to serve justice in these cases. And then I think another issue, which I'm also somewhat concerned about, is all these weapons going in. So you had a lot of we know that what is it, like 17,000 air defense weapons or anti-tank weapons. You have a really huge amount of weapons going in. I think we should really put it in perspective. This is much more that was being sent to Afghanistan during the 80s. I mean, especially in the beginning of the war in Afghanistan against where the United States supported the Mujahideen. They were very careful in the beginning. They sent in relatively little equipment in the beginning, and then it ramped up towards the end of the 80s. And so what is happening now is that, again, we send in a lot of weapons. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, obviously, these weapons, they were effective. They really stopped the Russian advance. I think this much we can tell. And they were a crucial part of it. But what I saw is that, I read statements from the Pentagon saying like, okay, we're wetting these units. We're going to make sure that, these weapons, they're not getting into the wrong hands. And then I'm really asking myself, okay, so how are you going to make sure of that? I mean, we saw where all the stingers that went into Afghanistan, where they eventually showed up, they showed up in Africa, they showed up across the Middle East. They were, being used for a lot of activities that really weren't in the US's interest. And this is another aspect where I'm really thinking, okay, you're sending in these weapons. How are you going to make sure that they're not, being redistributed? That I saw videos of some Chechenian groups that also were having end laws. Obviously, other smaller volunteer groups, using a lot of this equipment that was sent in clearly by the United States, by the European countries. And I think also this is a potentially dangerous development. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see these weapons in, 5 to 10 years showing up in different conflicts, in different contexts. And if they're going to cause some trouble for also for the United States, for European countries, I wouldn't be surprised about that.
No, it won't be a surprise. I mean, tomorrow for us is the anniversary of the recognition of the Vietnam War. So it's the Vietnam
Right.
War recognition as far as this anniversary is concerned. And we have even to this past year captured weapons are coming to the southern border. Some of those were used in Vietnam. That's how old they are. I mean, they
Right.
don't just become fairy dust. So the
Right.
fact is that you got these small drones now that are being introduced on the battlefield. I mean, they've done an absolute number on armor, and I think the future armor is really, unless it evolves, is in question right now. But when I was in Iraq, we saw how in Mosul, ISIS was using these cheap drones you can buy from Walmart. They were taking the timing
Right.
mechanism out of a 2 or 3 round with a paper clip and a rubber band, basically
Right.
dropping it and killing a number of Iraqi special
Right.
forces. And you got this one guy who doesn't have any type of a multi-training. He's played around maybe on a drone and seen some things on video games. And now the
Right.
person that can kill an special operator who been you spend all this money training him,
Right.
and absolutely resets the battlefield. I know that as I was talking to a friend of mine, when the phalanx initially was established on the battlefield, cav didn't go away. We eventually evolved the cav into a mechanized cav, but unless armor today goes through an evolution, I don't know how armor in the future is going to be relevant on the battlefield when you got a guy using less than $1,000 drone, basically
Right.
getting a real-time feed from, because thanks to Elon Musk, who's allowing this, curtain basically over Ukraine, which even the Russians are allowing it to stay on because they're using it for their advantage. So in the war against Ukraine, both Russians and Ukrainians are using a private company's ability to affect the internet in a country to be able to conduct combat ops and feeding real-time data to a small, cheap drone to knock out the Russian armor that's cost so much money to put together. So I don't know. How do you see, with everything we talked about, is there something we're missing? I mean, I know that we're going to talk about proxy wars. We're always going to have non-state actors. Do you think that in the long run, not in the short term, that this evolution and realignment of how Europeans, as you mentioned, Germany coming out and giving weapons to the battlefield, and maybe realigning differently with the rest of maybe not NATO but European nations, how do you see these affecting the state in itself? Because I know even to this day, our policy and governmental policies, whether it be the UN, it was a League of Nations, whatever it might be in the future, as people have said, the UN is irrelevant the way it's structured. How do you see it challenging what the notion of a state is? Do you think that we are going to morph possibly in the long term on how diplomatic decisions are made? Is the states going to be relevant in the long term, given how the non-state actor is evolving and how powerful he's becoming?
Well, very good question. I mean, obviously, super tough to answer. I mean, just quickly going back what you said about the Vietnam War, because I think it also is an interesting analogy, right? Because the Vietnam War, basically, it also started as a proxy war for the United States, brought in a lot of advisors in the beginning, and then it morphed into something else entirely. Obviously, you had conventional troops deploying and combat troops, and basically it turned into but it turned into an actual war, way more than just a proxy war, which is also something I'm very concerned about in the current situation, because we're always thinking like, of course, we're not directly involved in Ukraine right now. So Russia is basically, seeing this the same way as us. But who knows? Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen in a couple of days? There needs to be just a little bit of miscalculation on either side, and we're going to have a whole different thing happening. And so, to get back to your question, I think it's very hard for me to make any specific prediction, because there's so many different trajectories, so many potential ways this thing could go. I mean, for example, who knows whether European Union is still going to exist in 5 years from now. And of course, I mean, you can say that's ridiculous. This is never going to happen. But if somebody tells me that, I will just point to the fact that a lot of people also would have said this Russian invasion is never going to happen. That's ridiculous. This is this is nothing that we're going to really be confronted with. Putin is too smart to do that, and nonetheless it happens. So, we don't know, where this is going. So it's also interesting because basically one of the arguments is that actually, for example, in Europe, where I can probably speak best to that is that, actually, yes, the European Union will get even more power in the future, will become more of kind of this supranational entity. And, I would say I'm not very convinced by that. I don't think that, the state is going to go away anytime soon. And, specifically now looking, for example, and also European Union, looking back at, what happened during the COVID crisis 2 years ago, because, we have this notion in Europe. Well, obviously, first of all, obviously Switzerland is not part of it. So we're kind of doing our own thing. But, there's always this notion of European solidarity and, we're all working together. But then what happened in 2020 when COVID hit is that one of the first things that happened is that basically all the countries were really out looking for themselves, making sure that they're going to get enough facial masks and, get enough vaccines, obviously. So it was kind of obvious that this concept of, we're this supranational entity, we're working all together, we're all in this together, we're in solidarity. It works really well when you're not in a crisis. And it gets a little bit harder as soon as you're hit by a crisis. Now, of course, if we look what's happening in Ukraine right now, we can tell that probably Europe is as unified as it hasn't been in a lot of years, I would argue. I mean, obviously, there's still there's going to be more and more disagreements over time, I'm sure about that. But at least now in the initial reaction to the Russian invasion, I would say that there has been a remarkable unity. But I mean, I'm not convinced that this is going to last forever. I mean, for example, Europe now also in the beginning, they decided, okay, we're going to send in weapons. A lot of these countries did, but they will also have to, decide going forward, how long are we going to keep this up? Are we going to sustain the war effort indefinitely? Are we going to do it until the Russians are really depleted and, are going to sue for peace? Are they going to do it? We don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be so sure about that the Russians are going to, really look for an easy out anytime soon. And so it's going to be, I would say, and this is one of these things I wrote in this article on Lawfare, about the prospects of this proxy war between Europe and Russia. I mean, I focused more on the European perspective because in the US you have these discussions going on. Here it's a topic that is, being talked about much less. And I was basically saying that that's the thing, the European countries going forward, they will really have to think very hard, how they want to, deal with that, whether they want to continue this war effort, whether they want to send in more weapons. Also another question. So they send in some weapons that was enough to, at least stall the Russian offense for now. But what are you going to do going forward? Are you going to send in more offensive weapons, that will really help pushing out the Russians? Can you afford to do that? How are the Russians going to, react to that? Or do you decide to just, send in the same quality and quantity of weapons that you did until now, which basically means, I would argue that, this is going to be a stalemate that, will continue for quite a while. So I think there's a lot of very important discussions and also decisions that Europeans will have to have, obviously, in concert with the United States in the coming weeks.
Well, I give him credit. All the 27 nations of the EU came together and put the sanctions. Right. And now the hard part is going to be that all 27 have to agree to remove the sanctions. If one of them doesn't agree, they're stuck. So it's a reality of it. So A lot of moving pieces there. What do you call it? Non-state actors, proxy wars, conventional war.
Mm,
At the
mm,
end, we know one thing has to happen. When you get the armies involved, however you get them involved, you want to end it as quickly as
yes,
possible. Otherwise, you're going to have
right,
this, hydra forming that you can't even deal with.
right.
Look, February of 20 of last year was when China actually struck a partnership with SWIFT. Well, what does that mean? That means that China, using its spies, can look into all the transactions that are taking place across the globe from any nation.
Mm,
These are the issues you run into. We have companies here that are in chip technology. They're American registered companies, but the family members of or the heads of those companies are actually tied to family members in China through the Green
mm,
Gang, going back to the Chinese Communist Party. And on one end you have Disney here being criticized for not being tough against China, given the violations of human rights and people would say the genocide taking place. On the other hand, it's Southern has decided to become an enemy of Russia. But what if tomorrow Ukraine and Russia strike a deal? Now you're stuck.
right, right,
The Ukrainians will say
right,
you didn't give us the weapons we needed to win it. The Russians will say
right,
you supported the other side. So there goes your
right,
leverage on anybody. So I think more nations are going to have more of a say. And as they say sometimes, it's good to have one focal guy who basically makes a decision. That way, the state can function much more better, regardless if it's good or bad. Because as I always say, no decisions are good or bad decision. It's just a decision that has consequences. But once you bring
right.
everybody in, to include now even non-state actors, it becomes difficult. Look, I have my own non-governmental organ. We have a 501c3 that we are trying to support the Assyrian Christians that are stuck in Ukraine because it's costing money to get them out. But
Mm,
even that money for all the support for humanitarian effort that was coming in to help sustain Poland and the Baltic states that are taking in all these refugees that have now become a weapon that Russia is using against them. Guess what? That money's starting to dry up
yeah,
already because
exactly.
people are just at a limit of what they can give. So a lot of interesting topics. I know I asked you some really tough long-term strategic questions, but
Right.
I know you're the type of a guy who can at least simplify it for our audiences, and much
I
appreciated.
can I can tell you that in the end the answer depends. We don't know in the end. This is the one thing I can tell you for sure.
Well,
No,
that's
I
it.
mean
That's
maybe
it.
just
That's the answer.
maybe also just one point that it just made about the sanctions, which I also find very crucial, right? I mean, first of all, yes, we'll see how long this is, how this is going to work. Well, whether they will get along with that. Obviously, there's already loopholes in the sanction regime, and we clearly see that because the ruble is already recovering a bit. But also, I have to be very honest with you. One crucial problem I see with the sanction regime right now is also that for me, it's not entirely clear what Russia is supposed to do for the sanctions to be lifted. And I think this is, for example, this is also something that should be very clearly communicated. Because this wasn't really. I mean, it's not entirely clear. Let's say this war stops tomorrow, and Ukrainians and Russians, strike a deal. Are the sanctions going to be removed? And I'm not going to, give basically give my opinion, say yes, it should be removed or no, it shouldn't be removed. But I think it should be very clearly communicated, particularly to the Russians, and it should be made clear to them what they have to do for those sanctions to be removed, because otherwise they don't have an incentive to work towards removing them. And I think this is an issue that should be very high on the list of urgent issues right now for both the United States and for Europe.
I think it's a wonderful point to finish up on, Mike, and much appreciate your time again coming here. Mike, if people want to know more about you, or where can they go? I know we have a QR code that they can basically look at and go to some of the writings you have, but what do you have upcoming, and where can people learn more about the work you do?
Well, I mean, yeah, this is basically my Google Scholar profile, so you can check out some of my writings with this QR. What I have coming up, to be honest, I really have to get back to my PhD thesis. It's has been a bit of a problem in the last couple of weeks. I got to be honest with you. I haven't really had a lot of time working on that. I hope my advisors aren't listening in right now. No, but I really have to get back to that. And yeah, we'll see. Well, one thing that we're going to have coming up, but still going to take a while. We're basically working on this route ledge handbook of proxy wars, which is going to be a pretty big volume. I think there's going to be like 40 chapters, dealing with many different aspects of proxy wars. How do you control a proxy? How do proxy wars start? Why do they start? How are they ending? Under which conditions do states, for example, stop their support to proxies, etc. So this is a really exciting project, and I think it's going to be coming out sometime next year. I don't know. We'll see about that. There's there's always frictions coming in, making things taking a bit longer, making it a bit more complicated. But this is certainly a project I'm working on right now that I'm very excited about. I'm looking forward to it, seeing it in public.
You can blame the Russians, Putin goes in and screws up your entire book because now new things have been introduced into the process. So at least you could tell the professor that Colonel Sangari said, everything changing. Whatever was on the books that was fact last week just completely went by wayside right now. So it's amazing. Look, I wanted to everybody also to know that, again, if you like the show, what we're doing, guests like Michael, United Assyrian Appeal. Mike, if you didn't know, I'm actually working in the Horn of Africa. Once we lost Afghanistan, we realized if we lose not just Horn of Africa, East Africa, especially in South Sudan, we were going to run into a lot of problems for the U.S. footprint, as you were mentioning, whether or not U.S. is going to be there or not. And I think that, with the fact that we've really lost our footprint in Iraq, and if we lose that, that's it for us. I hate to say it, EU may have to go alone, politically over the next few years unless there's a change in our policy with elections coming up. Now, I know World Food Program pulled away from South Sudan, from Kenya, where there's a lot of refugees, decided to go to Afghanistan because projections are we might have 1.8 million losses by May because of the hunger and the possible global famine that is hitting. And we're trying our best to help there, and also still the Syrian Christian in northern Iraq and Syria need your help. And also I'm going to thank Cinema Production for the great job they do. Is because of their work that we're able to bring guests like Mike on our show. Mike, I'm going to give you the last word, buddy, before we take off. Any last thoughts for our audiences?
Well, yeah. Well, what can I say? To me, it's very clear. With this war breaking out in Ukraine, that this topic that I've been focusing on over the last couple of years, proxy wars, that it was kind of obviously it was always present. It was present with these wars in the Middle East, in Africa, etc. But I think what we have to realize now that we are really getting back into an era of great power competition. And proxy wars were very much really part and parcel of the last era of great power competition, obviously during the Cold War. And I think we really have to get used to the fact that we're seeing this coming back. We're really getting a blast from the past, so to speak.
Yes, definitely. The more things change, as they say, the more they stay the same. It seems like
Indeed.
Human character is the same, regardless of the toys you give them to kill each other. With that said, it was a pleasure having you here, Mike. I look forward to my autographed copy of the Proxy World War, and hopefully we'll see you again directly. Much appreciated, brother.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Take care. Bye, Sargis. Bye.
Outstanding. Thank you very much. God bless. And there's New Paradigms.